She's currently finishing a book entitled Syriac Missionary Legends, some of which I've had the pleasure of reading as in the form of her dissertation. I'm excited to see it come out and be published. And several other publication projects relating to Syriac saints and hagiography. And she's just starting an exciting project to put her arms around the entire corpus of Syriac saints, which could be which will be a grand endeavor. She took her PhD from Brown University in 2009 and her MA from Notre Dame in 2002. We're pleased to welcome Professor Saint-Laurent to us today and ask you to give her a warm welcome here.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm a little bit shorter. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm honored to be here. And it's a beautiful place to be. And our mountains in Vermont are much smaller than yours. So you're very lucky. Now, let's see if this... Okay. I'm going to be talking to you today about a subject which is very close to my heart, both on a personal level and as a scholar, and that is stories about holy people in the Syriac tradition. And I want to show you how this is a very important source, as I see it, both for understanding the theology of the people of the ancient, the Christians of the Near East, and also understanding their culture. I think that narrative is a very important source for these things, and it's my delight to show you some of my favorite stories. This is, as I see it, the greatest hits, in my opinion, of the corpus of the Syriac saints' lives. So, and I'm also going to be including a few images that I could find to illustrate the visual counterpart to the textual traditions that we'll be looking at today. You'll see here, this is actually, before I even get going, I'll introduce you to one of my favorite saints who is shown here, up here. Her name is Saint Febronia of Nisibis, and Nisibis is modern-day New Sabine in southeast Turkey. And she is a martyr and a monastic saint about whom I will be talking towards the end of my talk. But actually, what's fascinating about Febronia, Saint Febronia of Nisibis, is that devotion to her spread from the Syriac-speaking East all the way to Italy. And what you're looking at actually right up there, this is a pointer. Let's see if I can do this. Aha. It's always exciting when technology cooperates, right? This is a container in a museum in Italy, in Trani, which is close to Bari, where, according to tradition, her relics floated up upon the shore and were collected. So devotion to her, she's a Syriac saint, spread all the way to Italy. And so that in itself is very interesting to see how hagiography, or the lives of the saints, provided a portrait of Christianity in the East, also farther to the West. And as it were, devotion to her is even bigger now in Italy than in some places in the Middle East. So I'm going to show you why hagiography, which is by definition the genre of the lives of the saints, is, as I see it, a fascinating place for understanding the intersection of theology, culture, and narrative together. Sound good? All right. Just want to make sure we're all together here on the same page. Christianity had a privileged place for stories all the way back from its earliest beginnings. The Gospel of John, the Word was made flesh, and this notion of the Word meant that language had a privileged place for expression, and the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, that God was made flesh, meant that the human person, and above all a disciple of Jesus, could, by his or her life, demonstrate another aspect of Christ, if you will, which is why the saints were so important. They could, in their lives and how they lived their lives, demonstrate different ideals of what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus. And so spreading their stories was a way to spread the religion beyond just the stories of Jesus himself and the apostles. And as well, at the same time, as much as these stories were about individual holy people, they were about the communities that produced them. And so what you'll see is that different communities that I'll be talking about would rally around particular holy people and celebrate their stories and continue the traditions about these saints as a way to add strength and legitimacy to their own roots, lineage. So through the lives of the saints as well, different areas in the Near East and also throughout the Greco-Roman world could construct lineages all the way back to Jesus himself. So those are other very important aspects of talking about why hagiography is important. And of course, the word, as you all will probably know, hagiography in Greek comes from the word for holy and graphos, writing, hagiography. And I like it because it gives a human face to theological concepts. In other words, when we study the past, we can study the doctrine, which is very important. We can study the Bible, which is really important. But what's fun, I think, about studying the saints' lives is that you get a glimpse into personalities. And that word glimpse is very important because we're not going to know their whole stories. I like to think of the process of writing a saint's life comparable to painting a picture. And not only that, but painting a miniature. If you imagine that you had, this is perfect. You take this large, I'm pointing at this man over here. Who is this? I don't know. Okay, if we wanted to take this picture of Kennedy and shrink it down to the head of a pin and create a miniature version of that, how would we do that so that someone looking at that miniature form could still recognize and identify that person? We would have to focus on the aspects of him which make him most distinct, right? And that means leaving out some things in exchange for others. You're going to drop out a few details and magnify the things that make him memorable. And this is exactly, in a literary way, analogous to what hagiography does. These stories about the saints remember what is most memorable about that person and magnify it, often adding and embellishing with miracle accounts or things which might seem a little bit difficult to believe at times, if you're looking at it from a historical point of view, but for the sake of the memory, that's what makes them memorable. It's what made these outstanding characteristics. And Syriac, which is this dialect of Aramaic spoken around the city of Edessa in modern-day southeast Turkey, showed a propensity for talking and celebrating the holy people in its tradition. The word for holy or saint in Syriac is kadishe. And I've been working on a project which has been trying to collect all the lives of the saints and codify them and put them online so that we can share this information with the scholarly community. There are over 1,800 saints' lives in Syriac. Isn't that surprising? I was very surprised to learn this and very overwhelmed by this as well. Of course, some of them repeat the stories of the same person twice, so they're not necessarily 1,800 individual saints. But this is the sheer survival of so many stories about the saints demonstrates for us how important this was to the Syriac Christians. This is a picture from a monastery in Lebanon. Here you can see there's a little bit, unfortunately the image isn't too distinct. That says Yaakov, and so this is Jacob. So these are some of the apostles. So again, In the Syriac hagiographical tradition, we get an insight into the piety of the people. This isn't necessarily high-level theology that we might read from some of the doctors of the church of the past, but rather, what does it mean to live? What does holiness mean lived out in a particular time? So in my specialty is the late ancient period, so the 5th and the 6th century, 4th, 5th, and 6th century. And by seeing how people imagine what the life of a holy person was in this time, we have an insight into their culture. And you'll see in Syriac stories, there's a tremendous influence on the importance of the monks, the monastic culture. And also showing how the monks and the ascetic people modeled in their lives aspects of the apostles and Jesus himself. So that is also very important to Syriac hagiography, to craft a similarity in narrative to Jesus and the original apostles. Go. There. Oh, not that fast. Stop. There's one. Okay. This is another image here of a great Syriac saint. This is Saint Severus of Antioch. And so in the memory of the saints, in the Syriac tradition, you have different types of holiness, which are different types of the models of holiness, which are particularly popular. And we know they're popular because the different motifs of telling the story, literary motifs, get repeated and reshaped depending on the interest of the particular person telling the story. So martyrdom, extremely important. Throughout the early Christian world, and certainly including the Syriac tradition, the martyr was the one who, by virtue of his or her death, most an unjust death, imitated Jesus, who died also an unjust death. And so the Christians living in a time when it was when there were sporadic persecutions against Christians, martyrdom was seen in the beginning as the most perfect form of discipleship. And so it was very important for different communities to have a martyr in your ranks. It was a sign of validity and legitimacy. So what's very interesting, as much as these people really did live and die, the stories which developed around them became even more elaborate. And later traditions, generations after persecutions had ceased, would create stories about martyrs and retroject them back onto earlier periods as well to show that their community too had had a martyr. Monasticism, as I say, I'm going to talk about that later. Pastoral care, extremely important. And then that you would have the outstanding individual features, sort of almost of theatrical proportions, that these wonderful things these saints would do. But it wouldn't really matter if that person wasn't a kind person. In other words, the test of sanctity was always in charity. How does that work itself out on a person-to-person level? And you'll see that worked out in the saints' lives as well. And mission, extremely important in the Syriac saints' lives, that Jesus commissioned his apostles to bring the message of Christianity out to the nations, and that meant that every community had a missionary apostle somewhere to which they could trace their roots. And so the missionary saint had an extremely important place in Syriac memory as well. And you see that the virtues of Syriac theology would get grafted and projected and embellished onto the lives of the saints. Things like, in particular, purity of heart in Syriac, shafiuto de levo, asceticism, so discipline of the body, care of the poor, travel, mission, so very important, chastity, and also suffering. And this is very important, especially in the lives of the saints. What's beautiful about the suffering that they endure is that the story gives meaning to the suffering itself. It frames this suffering not as meaningless, but as discipleship of Jesus. And that's why these stories get repeated, because they provide, as they continue to, constant source of inspiration. Many of the communities of Syriac-speaking Christians have endured tremendous suffering through the centuries. And so having these saints as their ideals and looking to their examples is also a tremendous source of strength for earlier, for later traditions as well. They connect you to your past, which was modeled in this type of discipleship. Forward. I want to introduce the most important apostle. One of the most important apostles in the Syriac tradition is St. Thomas. This is a church to St. Thomas in Lebanon as well. Thomas, whose name means twin, as you all know, was for the Syriac-speaking Christians the most important apostle because it was he who took Christianity, according to their beliefs, along the Silk Road, all the way from Jerusalem down into northern India. And many, many stories about Thomas circulated in Syriac-speaking Christian traditions. But what's even more important is that the stories about St. Thomas were set up a prototype of what an apostle should be, what a missionary should be. The story of St. Thomas, which is most important in Syriac tradition, is the Acts of Thomas. The Acts of Thomas, which describes St. Thomas as a wandering missionary, detached. He goes from city to city, bringing Christianity to a community, often a kingdom. So the Syriac motif puts a lot of emphasis on converting entire kingdoms, and he brings a type of Christianity which overturns the dominant society because of its emphasis on care of the poor, giving up your possessions for the sake of the poor, building a new kingdom based on Christian virtues. And that gets him into a lot of trouble because people don't like that, right? So that's part of the entertaining aspect of the genre as well. He gets driven from city to city every time he converts the people. And at the end of his life dies also as a martyr. So St. Thomas moved along as a detached missionary apostle from place to place to place, all the way down to India. And even today, the Christians in India call themselves, as many of you may know, St. Thomas Christians, because they believe that it was he who brought the mission of Christianity to India in the original period. And as I said, so the text about him, which was the most important in Syriac, was the Acts of Thomas, narrating his story to India. And this is another image. This is actually from the church of Ha in Tur Abdin, in Syriac-speaking milieu here, of Jesus commissioning Thomas to bring Christianity to the East. And based on this model, and this is how hagiography works, based on the model that was set up in the Acts of Thomas, and according to the story, he was sold into slavery first by Jesus himself, and then sold himself into slavery, and through the garb of a slave brought Christianity to the kings of India. That model set up a prototype for other monks and missionary saints in the tradition. Detachment was of extreme importance in particular. And so you see, this is a picture. This is a beautiful image from the Rabbula Gospels, Syriac Bible, and you can see here. This is the descent of the Holy Spirit upon Mary and the apostles. The importance of having an apostolic root was very much stressed in Syriac hagiography, because what's going to happen later in the 5th and 6th centuries is that there will be conflict, surprise, surprise, right? Imagine that. There will be conflicts among the Christians over the nature of who Jesus Christ is, Christology. And this will unfortunately, tragically, divide Christians in the Greek-speaking East from the Syriac-speaking further Orient, if you will. And there will be debates over who is orthodox, who is right, who is legitimate. And they will fight virulently about this. And I'm not going to get into that today because we don't have time. But in the stories of their saints, one of the ways that they can defend their legitimacy is by showing that their communities could trace themselves in some way back to the apostles. And this is not this is the type of arguments that people still make today to show your lineage is a way of showing legitimacy and orthodoxy, all the way into present day religious context. Now, the greatest poet in the Syriac tradition is Saint Ephrem, as many of you may know. These are two images of Ephrem. This is a This is a modern one and this is an earlier one. This is an image of the death of Ephrem. And what's fascinating about Ephrem, he himself was not a hagiographer per se. In other words, he wrote poetry and hymnography. He didn't write stories about the saints. But for a person interested in the saints' lives, he provided models of what the ideals of holiness would be for the Syriac-speaking Christians in his poetry. And he quickly was recognized for his masterful talent as a theological poet. And surprise, surprise, there was a life written about Ephrem. Ephrem the Syrian was a deacon. He was not a monk, not at all. He was a deacon in the service of his bishop in the city of Nisibis. And yet, what's fascinating in terms of his life, the life of Ephrem, the hagiography of Ephrem, is that the later traditions turned him into a monk. Why would they do that? Anyone guess?
Even greater legitimacy.
And they themselves were probably monks. Yes, and this idea that the story of Ephrem had probably been preserved in monastic contexts. And if you're a monk and your greatest hero is Ephrem, well, is there really any harm done in saying that, imagining that he himself was a monk too, But this is how hagiography tends to work. You've got your ideals, and you want to also, and you know that the historical person did great things, but you can create more connection to that holy person by clothing them in your own garb, in symbols which are meaningful for your culture, which is what they did. And so here he is, dressed up like a monk, also down here. And that is very typical of how, in terms of the genre, how it tends to work. Oops. Go. And the other hagiographical sources for Ephrem come from another poet named Saint Jacob of Syriac, who is shown here in this 12th century manuscript. He's also being shown as a monk, and he wrote a hymn about Ephrem, which, although not itself a saint's life, celebrated Ephrem in terms of how he would ultimately be remembered by the tradition. So there were other sources for circulating ideas about the saints beyond just narrative. It was also included in hymnography. So Jacob of Syriac has a hymn on Saint Ephrem celebrating his life. Now, as we move along here, and I know I'm going very, very quickly, I promise I will slow down and leave time for some questions. But the most important thing in writing stories about the saints was to show that there was some way in biblical allusions or in similarities of the stories that the saint himself or herself modeled things that the apostles did. So you see here Jesus. This is a Syriac illuminated manuscript of Jesus's entry on Palm Sunday here coming, and And so very often the lives of the saints will have miracles which model those of Jesus himself in the Gospels. That's one of the most important motifs. Also the journey theme. So Jesus himself took, he said, take nothing with you for the road. And that idea of always being ready to get up and go at the drop of a hat was very important in the Syriac mission stories. And most importantly, however, the Jesus' death on the cross is the unjust death which was glorified by God through that sacrifice, will be the model for most important for the Syriac martyrs. And among his apostles as well, the story, certain motifs about the apostles will become very important models or precedents for other Syriac saints. So in the case of Mary Magdalene, there was a prototype that she had been a sinful woman who loved Christ deeply and was converted by being loved. In being forgiven by Christ, she changed her life around. And that model of the penitent woman as well will circulate with great frequency in Syriac hagiography, and I'll show you an example about that as well. So these were the biblical precedents to add legitimacy to the life of a saint. Here she is right here. So St. Pelagia of Antioch, there are many, many stories about Pelagia, and not just in Syriac, but the Syriac story is probably, I think, the best. In any case, she was, according to tradition, how many of you know the story of Pelagia already? Anyone? Oh, good, I get to introduce to you one of my favorite stories. So this is St. Pelagia of Antioch. She was a prostitute in the city of Antioch, and she was very, very popular indeed. She was a circus dancer who attracted attention by the loose her loose behavior. She was always surrounded by an entourage of actors and troops. She was a model of sin, if you will, in Antioch, in entertainment. According to her story, however, she had a dramatic change of heart and a desire to give up her ways. And that's exactly what she does. She goes from being the worst sinner to the best saint. She's the worst prostitute, and she will become, by the end of her life, a monk, as the story goes. She repents publicly for her sins in front of the whole church. And that image of stripping off the old self and putting on the new is very powerful, because what the story of the penitent harlot demonstrates, the ideal which gets embellished in the narrative, is that anyone can change his or her life. If she can do it, so can I. Right? So can I, or so can you. And it's the story of a transformation of love. Here's a woman who had a lot of love to give. She was giving it to the wrong people, right? She had to take that love and redirect it to God, completely. And that has tremendous appeal, that ideal, that possibility of forgiveness and transformation. So this prostitute becomes, through her conversion, a chaste bride of Christ, as the story goes. And this story was very, very popular in Syriac imagination and had many other varieties. There were many other women like Pelagia in the tradition, and stories about these women that get circulated. She, in an effort to totally divorce herself from her former life as a prostitute, she flees to Jerusalem and dresses up like a monk and takes on the name Pelagios. They think she's a man until she dies, and then they realize, oh, this wasn't a man. Surprise. Right. And so that too, that's this image of the changed self. So the woman who becomes a monk, the prostitute who becomes a monk. So the penitent harlot was a very important model about Christian love and forgiveness and transformation of the self in Syriac tradition. John the Baptist, isn't that great hair? This is from another Syriac monastery. He was a very important model for a monk, which is kind of obvious. He himself had fled into the desert and lived on locusts and wild honey. Doesn't sound very good, does it? And through the example of John the Baptist, the monks took comfort or took their model. It's in the desert, according to the late ancient Christians, that you would meet your temptations face to face. You flee the city, you go out to the desert to meet the devil one-on-one and to live a life of penance. And you discipline your body through fasting and asceticism and to be a vehicle for the grace of God. You use your body to glorify God. And the saint's life puts the human body, in particular, at the center of the story, that you don't abuse your body. You have to protect you are created in God's image, but you have a possibility to become like God, and your body is your greatest companion in that journey. It becomes the meeting point of the human and the divine when you turn your free will to let that happen, when you direct your free will so that your body becomes the vehicle for the Spirit. John the Baptist demonstrated that. And so many stories about monks would be built on his model, as well as on the stories of the prophets from the Old Testament. One of the most famous monks in the Syriac tradition was Simeon the Stylite. Oops, I'm going to just jump right over that slide to show you this picture. Many of you may have heard of Simeon the Stylite. Unlike most of us, Simeon spent most of his life on a pillar. I mean, maybe some of you have done that. I keep trying to get my students back in Vermont to volunteer to bring this practice back, but nobody seems interested at all, But anyway, Simeon the Stylite was an ascetic who wanted to get, according to the stories, and there were many stories about Simeon, who wanted to get closer to God through disciplining his body. So the stories about Simeon was that he had been frustrated by the laxity of the monks in his own community. They kicked him out because he was so fierce in his practices. Since he got kicked out, he went off on his own and eventually comes to build a pillar. So the Greek word for pillar is stulos, and we get this word stylite. And he built it outside of the city of Antioch. And this is the remains of that place today. So this is Kalat Siman in Syria. Oops, here, the remains of his pillar. He lived there for days at a time with his arms outstretched in penance to God, and his mind directed to God. And this physicalization of a man who was so eager to get to God that he would literally elevate himself from the earth to get closer to God was a powerful lived symbol of detachment from the world. And he quickly gained a lot of apostles, a lot of disciples. People were fascinated by the strangeness of his act. They thought he was crazy. Imagine that. Yeah, they did. They thought he was crazy. And they accused him of doing the whole thing for theatrical display. But as the storytellers say, no, it wasn't for his own sake, but rather by doing something a little bit crazy, he could take people's attention and turn their hearts to God. In other words, now that I'm standing up on top of this pillar, now that I've got your eyes, now listen to me, and I'm going to tell you that you need to change your life. It was that by the strangeness of his act, turn people's lives and attention to God. And so, ironically, he became a great arbitrator in worldly affairs. So there are stories in his hagiography about how he intervened, for instance, when cucumber farmers would have a dispute over, economic affairs. Because he seemed to be completely detached from worldly concerns, it made him a great mediator in worldly concerns. And so this was one of the very interesting paradoxes of these types of Stylite saints. So this is another very important model, which blends, in many ways, it blends the model of a monk with another very important model, and that is of the holy fool. Someone who seems by the outside to be a little bit insane, but that insanity is because of his or her devotion to God. And we don't really have this in the Western tradition. This is something which really exists in the East. Something kind of to ponder that for a minute too. We also don't really have Stylite saints as well. Maybe someday. I'm trying to bring it back. And here's a few more images of Simeon here on his pillar. And he was often likened to being like a priest on top who was conducting his liturgy. So here in this icon, he's being shown with his censers here. And then here as well, being blessed by Christ. And this was his disciple who imitated him. Can you imagine? It just captures the imagination. And that is the power of hagiography. You'll never forget that now. I'm going to jump ahead here and get on to our next saint. Otherwise, we're running out of time. Am I correct? I have how much time? A few more minutes? 5 more minutes? Okay. I'm going to jump ahead to the story of Febronia. This will be my last saint of the day. She was a woman who, according to tradition, lived in Nisibis. Again, Nisibis is in modern-day southeast Turkey. And the stories of Febronia were important because it was a story which was purported to have been written by a woman, which is actually very interesting. According to the tradition, Febronia lived in the time of the Diocletian persecution, and she lived with a community of ascetic sisters, we might call them nuns, and although we didn't really have monasticism in that part of the world yet, a later tradition, and her life was created in the 6th century, retrojected that back onto the landscape of Nisibis. And she was a woman noted for her beauty and her learning and her courage. So in the story, as it were, her convent gets besieged by a Roman army, and they want to marry Febronia off to a Roman officer. Otherwise, she faces death. And she, unlike the other sisters, does not flee. So the story goes that many of the sisters in her convent, out of fear, fled. But Febronia, as in her courage, stood up to the Romans, and she refused to marry the guard, and she suffered the consequences of a gruesome death. And so this is a model that combines really the ideals of the monastic, the learning and the discipline and the asceticism, together with those of the martyr. And they try to humiliate her by tearing her body apart in very gruesome fashion. And the more they do that, the stronger she becomes. And that is also very typical of the life of a saint as well, that when you try to humiliate them, they become stronger. It's this paradoxical subversion of power. And so Febronia had a great devotion in the Syriac East, and her life was quickly translated into Greek and Latin. So what was very interesting for me was last summer I got to go to Italy and see the places where her life is remembered and celebrated even today. You're looking at a banner from a small village in Sicily known as Patti. The story got translated later in the 8th century, and people clung to her as a patron saint. Febronia, all the way from Nisibis, all the way to Sicily, where today her life is still celebrated and remembered, and people have 3 different feast days in this little village in honor of Febronia of Nisibis. So it's a very interesting example of how these stories about saints can get diffused. So this is actually another community in Sicily here, Pelagia, and this is Febronia as well. And I think this is important. It shows us how the lives of the saints were important ways that Christianity and notions of Christianity got diffused in different parts of the late ancient, early medieval world. What the Christians in Italy and Sicily knew of Syriac-speaking Christianity came, in other words, often through the lives of the saints that had reached their traditions. I'm going to stop there now and be happy to take your questions. I hope that this has been helpful or interesting to you. So thank you very much. Yes, please.
How important is St. Augustine of Hippo?
In the Syriac tradition? As far as I know, he is not that important. He is not a saint who gets a lot of devotional attention, to the best of my knowledge.
Why do you think that is?
Goodness. I think that perhaps it was a different place of theological. How shall I put this? I think what Augustine was interested in was very much coming out of his particular time, his experience in Latin, the Latin-speaking world, and the questions that the Syriac-speaking Christians were interested in were not things that he was thinking about or talking about. Yeah. Yes, please.
Can you tell us a little bit about the interaction between Islam and Syriac Christianity?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a very big question. In what capacities? In just in general, or?
This is for the recording, so it's not because she can't hear you, it's for the video.
In general, just a little bit so I can understand what's going on, but
Sure.
also, if there is any sort of, saints coming out of that
Yes.
interaction.
Yes, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. In the beginnings, in the 7th century, as Islam is coming onto the map, the Christians whom Muhammad and his disciples will meet first are Syriac-speaking Christians. That's the first Christianity that he will confront, if you will. And so, indeed, in the 7th century, we have a lot of fascinating Syriac saints' lives about the early interactions between Christians living in the Middle East and the Muslims. So there's a lot of very important, and unfortunately, a lot of that work is just now coming to light. But it's going to become, I think, increasingly an important source for understanding the beginnings of Islam is going to be to look at many of these sources, and the presentation of the comings of Islam through the views of the Syriac-speaking Christians is something which is getting increasing attention. And hagiography, I think, is going to be very important because it's going to mean what's going to be required of the saints is going to be a new talents, really, and a new understanding of what it means to be a Christian, because very often those Christians in particular were not necessarily in union with the Christianity in the Byzantine world, which was Chalcedonian. So that was the complexity of the Christian situation at that time, because many of them were non-Chalcedonian Christians. So you had a Christianity in the Middle East that was fragmented, and unfortunately, that was the Christianity that Muhammad will first confront. Yes, please. Young man in the orange sweater.
So you mentioned Saint Ephrem, who was a deacon,
Yes.
and I was just wondering how common, as you've sifted through the lives of these saints, is it for them to be non-monastic saints and then later on created into monks?
It seems to have happened with a particular frequency in Syriac Christianity, and I think one of the reasons that was because the stories about the saints would circulate in an oral form before they would be written down. And the centers of the literate culture was very often connected to a monastery. And that's where these things got preserved. And so, as I say, it wasn't exclusive exclusively monastic, but there was definitely a preference for those ideals. And you have a very interesting collection of saints' lives from the 6th century by a man called John of Ephesus. And he wrote a lot about the laity in his saints' lives, which is why that's actually a very important source, because he talks about families and how one can achieve sanctity through the model of the family as well. In other words, you don't have to just be a monastic or a celibate saint. So there are multiple, but there was a privileged place on, even in the family, even within familial contexts, a notion of having continence, for instance, in the marriage was very important, and discipline. You could turn your little family into a monastery too. You see that. And when the lives of the saints will often talk about how children who are destined is the wrong word, destined to become saints will show their holiness already at a young age. You have stories about little children who refuse to nurse from one of their mother's breasts because they're starting their fasting practices at a young age. And these will become monks at a later time. So, yes, please.
Thank you so much. I find myself interested in the differences in portrayal between male and female saints.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if it's male saints are more common, if female saints come along later. I find it interesting that I believe it was Pelagia, you said,
Mm-hmm.
who snuck into a monastery as a man and spent the rest of her life. So are there any differences that you see there that you could comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. There were certain things which were shared ideals for men and women that you see in the lives of the saints. However, how that gets imagined is different. So in other words, bravery is always important for a saint and what that means. And but it takes a different form. For instance, in Febronia's story, her bravery means they make a lot in her story about the sexualized way that she was tortured. They cut off her breasts and they humiliate her. But she is steadfast and brave, and and so that's an ideal which is shared for a man or a woman. But it takes on a particular. I think in the stories of the women, it's often connected to their sexuality in some way, somehow sexualized. Whereas with the men, that's not as much of a case. The stories of the male saints will focus, I think, more on their discipline of the body and their detachment. And you don't see women standing on pillars, for instance. That's a very public display of sanctity. You don't really see that, and so I think there's much more of a public way that holiness gets envisioned for the male saints, and they can become bishops as well too. So the monk bishop, that's a possibility, not open to the women. So there are differences, and your point about Febronia becoming a monk at the end, it was. How shall I put it? That motif as well, they call them the transvestite saints, actually, was really popular because it was imagined that was the ultimate way that the prostitute had conquered her sexuality, was really by becoming a man. She had transformed herself into that, so, yeah.
We should probably finish there. Nicole, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for